So our next speaker is one that all the people that are watching at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville have been waiting for the whole time. So please, here in the auditorium, please welcome the department head from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, Dr. David Bassett. They're all screaming your name.
Go Vols. He's a former Vol, by the way. All right, about 4 years ago, I had the chance to develop a special type of exercise physiology class, one that was dedicated to the study of human performance. You know, Olympians, world champions, athletes exercising in extreme environments, this is a really interesting topic. And so, together with a former doctoral student, Scott Conger, we put together a course called Physiology of Athletes, Exploring the Limits of Human Performance. I think all of us have a natural fascination with the performances of incredible athletes. You know, we want to know more about what the physiological traits they possess in order that allow them to be capable of these feats of extreme endurance and power and speed. So we start off the course by talking about the athlete's heart. Here on a chest x-ray, you can see the heart shadow of a normal 45-year-old on the left and a 45-year-old marathon runner on the right. The marathon runner happens to be Hal Higdon, who is a writer for Runner's World, and he was a 2:29 marathoner at the age of 48. You can see an incredible difference in the size of the ventricles. The marathon runner has a much greater stroke volume, which gives him a greater maximal cardiac output and a higher maximal oxygen consumption. Sometimes, however, you'll see on a heart shadow an enlarged heart, and it's not indicative of improved function. In some individuals, they have what's called left ventricular hypertrophy. So their left ventricle is actually greatly thickened in response to valvular defects or very high blood pressure. This is not a normal finding, and it increases the likelihood of arrhythmias and myocardial infarction. So we'd like to be able to distinguish between the athlete's heart on the one hand and left ventricular hypertrophy on the other. One of the ways we can do that is by looking at the magnetic resonance image of the heart within the chest wall. And you can see here that the endurance athlete's heart on the left is a perfectly balanced and proportionally enlarged heart. It's healthy in every respect in terms of wall thickness and circumference and ejection fraction. Now, are there any instances where endurance training is bad for the heart? Well, this is a case study of atrial fibrillation in a master's rower. This rower was competing in the Head of the Charles Regatta up in Boston, and up at the top you see a graph showing one of his normal races. You know, his heart rate went up, plateaued very nicely, his boat speed stayed pretty constant throughout the race until he put on his final spurt at the end. But down at the bottom you see one of his disastrous races. Here, a couple minutes after the start of the race, he went into atrial fibrillation, and you can see the heart rate monitor just start to go crazy. At the same point in time, his boat speed plummeted. The author of this article concluded that in his most important race of the year, this rower suffered his only known paroxysm of atrial fibrillation. It lowered his heart rate, it lowered his speed, his cardiac output, and his rankings. It was not a good day at the races. In fact, an increase in atrial fibrillation, or the prevalence of atrial fibrillation, is a common finding in studies that have looked at this. Some studies find that endurance athletes are 5 times as likely to have atrial fibrillation as normal, everyday folks. Potential mechanisms include increased vagal tone, sudden sympathetic impulse, oxidative stress, and the enlargement of the atria. Now, in the course, we also look at some case studies of individual athletes. These were 2 of the best distance runners in the United States in the 1970s. Steve Prefontaine on the right and Frank Shorter on the left. They participated in a really incredible study in 1975, which was down at the Aerobics Center in Dallas, Texas, not too far from here, in which the researchers brought in the top 20 distance runners, middle and long distance runners in the United States. They looked at all sorts of physiological variables. So just to tell you a little bit about these athletes. You may know some of them if you're a fan of running, but Steve Prefontaine on the left, he was the shorter, more muscular of the two runners. He held 7 NCAA championships in track and cross country, and he also broke American records in every distance from 2,000 meters to 10,000 meters. Frank Shorter on the right was the best marathon runner in the world in the 1970s. And he won a gold medal in Munich, and he also won a silver medal in Montreal. So if we look at these two individuals, we can see that Frank Shorter on the right is the taller and leaner of the two. He also had a lower percentage of body fat, 2% body fat, and he had a very high percentage of slow twitch fibers in his gastrocnemius muscle. Prefontaine had the highest VO2 max of any of the distance runners that they tested. He was 84 milliliters per kilogram per minute. Shorter, on the other hand, had the lowest VO2 max of all 20 distance runners that they tested, 71.3. How is it then that Shorter could come away from, with the gold medal in the Olympic marathon? Well, a lot of it has to do with running economy. So the researchers put these runners on the treadmill at 10 miles per hour and 12 miles per hour and measured their oxygen consumption. Frank Shorter had the lowest oxygen consumption of any of the runners at 12 miles per hour. It was about 57 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So he used less oxygen to go at a given speed compared to the other marathon runners and the other middle long distance runners. Shorter's running economy is actually about equal to that of the best Kenyan runners today. And he shares some of their physiological traits. A body mass index below 20 kilograms per meter squared, very long, slender limbs, and a smooth, economical style of running. So, in using a car analogy, I think we can kind of say that Steve Prefontaine is more like a Corvette, and Frank Shorter is a little bit more like a Toyota Prius. Now, at the other end of the extreme, we can look at sprint athletes. This is Colin Jackson, who is still the current world record holder in the 60-meter high hurdles. He's also broken the world record in the 110 high hurdles, and he's brought home an Olympic silver medal. A few years ago, he traveled to Ball State University, where Scott and Todd Trappe took muscle biopsies on him, and they looked at his muscle fiber type. Colin Jackson has about 33% muscle fibers with the type 2X myosin heavy chain isoform. These the researchers dubbed the super fast twitch fibers, and he has the highest percentage of super fast twitch fibers ever seen in a sprinter. So this explains why it is that Colin Jackson is able to explode out of the starting blocks just like he's shot out of a cannon. Now we know that muscle fiber type is pretty much an inherited trait. So from this standpoint, we can say that Colin Jackson is extremely genetically talented, a gifted individual, and that he chose his parents very wisely. Now in the course, we also want to look at athletes who are exercising in extreme environments. So one group of athletes we look at are high-altitude mountaineers. This happens to be Hilliard and Tenzing, who were the first climbers ever to summit Mount Everest in 1953. You can see that they were using bottled oxygen because the barometric pressure on top of Mount Everest is only about 1/3 of what it is at sea level. So they have a hard time saturating their arterial blood with oxygen, and to do that, they have to breathe high oxygen gas mixtures. Physiologists had long calculated that it would be physically impossible for any human to attain the summit of Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen. But in about 1976, Reinhold Messner and Peter Haveler proved them wrong. They summited Mount Everest without using bottled oxygen. Reinhold Messner then went on to do a solo ascent of Mount Everest without bottled oxygen, and he then climbed all 14 mountains in the world over 26,000 feet, again, without the use of bottled oxygen. So there is absolutely no question that he is the best high-altitude mountaineer in the world. He can do things that nobody else can even dream of. Now we can learn a little bit more about Messner's physiology because he took part in this study published in Journal of Applied Physiology in 1986. He was in the group of high-altitude climbers, and they compared them to a group of sedentary control subjects and a group of endurance runners who competed at sea level. The climbers had a similar high percentage of type 1 fibers or slow twitch fibers compared to the endurance athletes, and they also had a very high capillary density in their skeletal muscles. You might think that Reinhold Messner would have a VO2 max level similar to Steve Prefontaine's, maybe 80 mLs per kg per minute. But they also tested VO2 max at sea level, and surprisingly, Reinhold Messner's VO2 max was 48 mLs per kg per minute. That's the textbook value for a sedentary, untrained, college-age male. So how is it that Reinhold Messner can climb all of these mountains and do things that nobody else in the world can do when he's got an absolutely ordinary garden variety athlete type of VO2 max? Well, the answer comes from the same study, because in this study, they put Reinhold Messner and the other subjects on a cycloergometer pedaling at 90 watts. And they had them breathe a hypoxic gas mixture containing about 10% oxygen. Reinhold Messner's the hemoglobin in his arterial blood achieved 92.6% saturation. The other climbers were 75%, and the sedentary control subjects were only 69%. So the answer to how Reinhold Messner can do these things is that he has an incredible set of lungs. He has a very high diffusion capacity for oxygen in his lungs, and he can saturate his arterial blood with oxygen as he goes up in altitude. Now, at the other extreme, we want to consider athletes who are diving to the deepest depths in the ocean. And there's a sport called free diving. The scientists call it no-limits apnea, which involves taking a breath of air on the surface of the ocean and going as far down as you can, and then you've got to swim back up to the surface in order to take your next breath. So the world record holder for women in sport is Tanya Streeter. She holds the record of 525 feet underwater. And in order to do this, she's got to be able to hold her breath for about 5 to 6 minutes. How does she do it? Well, one of the ways she does it is by hyperventilating. When you hyperventilate, you blow off CO2, and you decrease the levels of CO2 in your bloodstream. CO2 is a powerful stimulus to breathe, so if you can lower your starting level of CO2, you can increase your breath hold time. She has also engaged in breath hold training for years, and over time, if you practice holding your breath for longer and longer periods of time, you can kind of blunt your body's response to high levels of CO2. Another thing she does is called gulping, or packing air into her lungs. And so right before she dives, she does a procedure that goes something like this. And she just takes deeper and deeper breaths of air. She can hyperinflate her lungs by about 40%. And as she goes under, the pressure of the surrounding water is going to compress her lungs back down to a very, very small size. This allows her to store more oxygen in her lungs so that she can stay underwater for a longer period of time. So a recent study was done where they looked at some predictors of breath holding time in human apneic divers. And what they found was that these divers have very, very large lung volumes. They also have very large spleens. And you kind of go, well, why would having a large spleen help? The spleen serves as a reservoir of red blood cells. And when you dive, the hypoxia causes your spleen to constrict. It pushes those red cells out into the circulation where they can carry oxygen to the vital organs like the brain and the heart. That's a very dangerous sport, by the way, and many, many people have died trying to break the world record in human apneic diving. So toward the end of the course, we take a look at some aging athletes. An interesting case study was conducted by David Kostel. He looked at Derek Clayton, who for more than a decade held the world record in the marathon at 2:08:33. He tested him in 1970 when Derek Clayton was age 28, and then he tested him again 22 years later when Derek Clayton was age 50. You can see that there was hardly any change in body weight over that period of time, and the VO2 max stayed absolutely constant at 5.1 liters per minute. How is this possible? Well, Derek Clayton never stopped hard training. He continued hard training and competition for 22 years. Another such study is that of this Danish rower, Eskild Ebbesen, and VO2 max tests done on him over a 20-year time span between the ages of 20 and 40 showed that he also had no decline in his VO2 max. This was despite having a 20 beat per minute decrease in his maximal heart rate. But what happened was that he increased his stroke volume to compensate, and so his maximal cardiac output showed no change. You can see here that Ebbesen competed in 5 different Olympics, and he brought home 3 gold medals and 2 bronze medals. Now, there are even athletes who continue hard training and competition into their 70s and into their 80s. And I think this is a fairly dramatic illustration of some of the benefits of very vigorous and prolonged endurance exercise. On the top, you see a 40-year-old triathlete. The MRI is showing a cross-section through the thigh muscles. On the bottom, you see a 70-year-old triathlete. Looks pretty much like the 40-year-old triathlete, at least on macroscopic observation. And then in the middle, you see a 74-year-old sedentary man. Now, obviously, there are huge differences in the muscle mass of these individuals, in the subcutaneous fat underlying the skin. But also, if you look closely at the bones, you will see that the femurs of the triathletes are very thick. They have very thick cortical bone, and they are very robust. They are also shaped like a teardrop. Why would that be of benefit? Well, it helps the bone to withstand bending and breaking when you flex it in the fore-aft direction. The 74-year-old sedentary man, on the other hand, has femurs that are round in cross-section, and they're very thin-walled. They would break like a pencil if he fell down. So we end the class on the last day with a competition. It's a swimming race against an 81-year-old guy, Bill Lauer. I have to admit, I brought in a ringer, okay? He happens to be like a national champion in several different events. He goes head-to-head with Dave Costel in the 80 to 85 age category. So he has continued hard interval training 3 or 4 days a week and strength training in his off days. The students insisted on a 200-meter freestyle. I think he wanted to do 400 or 800-meter butterfly, but they couldn't do butterfly. So we did 200-meter freestyle. And Bill Lauer got up on the starting blocks, dove into the water. His time was 2 minutes and 49 seconds. And he beat the first student by about 2 minutes. So it was a pretty good lesson, I think, that these endurance athletes, they really have some special characteristics. We don't know in particular whether this is due to superior genetics or whether it's due to hard work and specificity of training, or maybe it's due to a combination of both. But I think giving students the idea that there's something really interesting here causes them to think deeply about these kinds of problems. And perhaps in doing so, it will bring out the inner athlete in each of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bassett. Great talk. Got some questions here for you.
Okay.
Sachio from Georgian Court University, he points out that the early studies that you talked about with all the runners and so forth were done in the early 70s to the 90s. Have other people done more recent studies with, we'll say, more modern athletes?
There have been, but I don't know of any studies that have really taken that many muscle biopsies on recent athletes. There are certainly studies done looking at VO2 max and running economy, however.
And the same hypotheses have come out of the newer studies?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fabulous. By doing the extreme measures and practices, we're talking about especially the free diving, to achieve the highest level of performance, does that cause any harm to these athletes, such as arrhythmias? You talked a little bit about that with the running. Do those athletes also have that?
No, they tend not to have arrhythmias, but often they can pass out underwater, and this is what has probably resulted in the death of several of them. So it is a very risky and dangerous sport. It's not one that I would recommend to any of my kids or students.
Yeah. Just to follow up on your last slide, what were the ages of the students that were beaten by Bill in the swimming challenge?
You know, they were undergraduates, so 20 to 22 years of age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to note that the article about the free divers showed that they have increased spleen size, which is also seen in racehorses. That's one of the advantages the racehorses have.
Yes, and dogs have large spleens as well.
And dogs as well.
Yeah, it's a natural blood doping effect. You squeeze down on the spleen and it just throws the red blood cells out into the circulation.
So if you want to be a good endurance runner, you need a bigger spleen.
Maybe.
Build your spleen. Okay, great. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Bassett. Please join me in thanking Dr. Bassett.